Picture this. A brilliant Jewish scientist stands in his laboratory in 1933 Berlin, watching through the window as Nazi brownshirts march through the streets. He knows they're coming for him. His groundbreaking research on uranium has caught Hitler's attention, but not in the way you'd think. The Führer doesn't want his genius. He wants him silenced, erased, forgotten. This scientist will flee across an ocean, change his name, and work in absolute secrecy on a project so powerful it would end the war that Hitler started. But here's the twist that'll blow your mind. The weapon this Jewish refugee helped create wasn't just any bomb. It was the bomb, the Manhattan Project. And the man? His name was Leo Szilard, and his story reads like the greatest revenge plot ever written. Because while Hitler was busy trying to purify his master race, he was actually exiling the very minds that would engineer his downfall. Before we dive into this incredible story of genius, exile, and the ultimate historical irony, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. This is the kind of history they don't teach in school. And trust me, you won't want to miss a single chapter of this journey. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The Physicist Who Saw the Future. Leo Szilard wasn't your typical scientist. Born in Budapest in 1898, he possessed something rare, the ability to see around corners, to anticipate what others couldn't imagine. By the 1920s, he'd already established himself as one of Europe's most promising physicists, working alongside legends like Albert Einstein in Berlin. But Szilard had another gift, a paranoid streak that would save his life. On the morning after the Reichstag fire in February 1933, while most of his colleagues were still debating whether Hitler's rise was temporary, Szilard was already packing. He'd read Mein Kampf. He knew exactly what was coming for Jews like himself. Within weeks, he'd liquidated his assets, stuffed his most important papers into a suitcase, and boarded a train to Vienna. He was one of the first to leave. Many of his friends who stayed, convinced that reason would prevail, would never escape. But Szilard didn't just flee, he organized. He created an underground network to smuggle Jewish scientists out of Nazi Germany, placing them in universities across Britain and America. He understood something fundamental. The Nazis weren't just threatening lives, they were threatening the future of science itself. Every physicist, chemist, and mathematician they drove out was a potential weapon they'd handed to their enemies. In London, on September 12, 1933, something happened that would change history. Szilard was walking through Southampton Row, frustrated after reading a dismissive article about the impossibility of extracting energy from atoms. As he waited at a traffic light, an idea struck him with such force that he froze mid-step. What if you could find an element that, when split by a neutron, released 2 neutrons? Those 2 would split 2 more atoms, releasing 4 neutrons. 4 would become 8, 8 would become 16, a chain reaction. Exponential power, infinite energy, or an infinite explosion. He immediately filed a secret patent, sensing the military implications. Szilard had just conceptualized the nuclear chain reaction, the fundamental principle behind atomic bombs. And he'd done it while in exile, driven from his home by the very man who would later desperately want this knowledge. The irony was already writing itself. Hitler had just expelled the man who would hand the Allies the key to ultimate power. But Szilard faced a problem. His theory needed proof, and proof required resources he didn't have. Britain wasn't interested in funding what seemed like science fiction. So he set his sights on America, writing letter after letter to universities, foundations, anyone who would listen. Most ignored him. This Hungarian refugee talking about splitting atoms and chain reactions seemed like a dreamer at best, a lunatic at worst. Yet Szilard persisted because he could see what others couldn't: the timeline. He knew German scientists were brilliant. He knew they had the same physics journals he did. He knew they would eventually arrive at the same conclusions. And unlike him, they had Hitler's full backing, unlimited resources, and no moral hesitations. The race was on, even if only one person knew they were racing. For now, Szilard could only watch, wait, and warn anyone who would listen that a storm was gathering, and when it broke, atoms themselves would be the weapons. But Chapter 2, The Discovery That Shook the World, December 1938. While Leo Szilard struggled to convince anyone of his chain reaction theory, news exploded from Berlin that confirmed his worst fears. Two German chemists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, had successfully split the uranium atom. Nuclear fission was real. But here's where it gets interesting. They couldn't fully understand their own results. It took Lise Meitner, a Jewish physicist who'd fled to Sweden, to explain what they'd actually done. Once again, a Jewish mind in exile made sense of Nazi science. When Szilard heard the news in New York, he didn't celebrate the breakthrough. He panicked. He immediately understood what this meant. His theoretical chain reaction was now experimentally possible. And worse, the Germans had discovered it first. Szilard spent sleepless nights imagining Nazi scientists calculating neutron yields, designing reaction chambers, briefing Hitler on a bomb that could level entire cities. The nightmare was coming true. He rushed to Columbia University, where his friend Enrico Fermi, another refugee, this time from fascist Italy, was conducting experiments. Together, they worked frantically through January and February 1939, trying to confirm whether uranium fission released enough neutrons to sustain a chain reaction. Their calculations were promising, their experiments encouraging. It could work. It would work. And if they could figure it out, so could Werner Heisenberg and the other brilliant physicists still in Germany. But the American government wasn't listening. Szilard tried to warn military officials, wrote memos to anyone with clearance, explained the devastating potential of nuclear weapons. He was dismissed as an alarmist, a foreigner with wild theories. America was still isolationist, convinced Europe's problems would stay in Europe. The idea that atoms could be weapons seemed absurd to practical military minds focused on battleships and bombers. Desperate, Szilard realized he needed a voice that couldn't be ignored. He needed Einstein. The world's most famous scientist, also a Jewish refugee, also someone who understood exactly what Nazi Germany was capable of. In July 1939, Szilard drove out to Einstein's summer cottage in Long Island. He brought along another Hungarian physicist, Edward Teller, who'd later become known as the father of the hydrogen bomb, another refugee Hitler had expelled. Einstein listened to Szilard's explanation of chain reactions and immediately grasped the implications. His face grew grave. "I never thought of that," he murmured. Together, they drafted a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Einstein's signature gave it weight, but Szilard's words provided the urgency. The letter warned that Germany might be developing atomic bombs and urged America to begin its own research immediately. It was delivered to Roosevelt in October 1939, just weeks after Hitler had invaded Poland. But even Einstein's name couldn't cut through bureaucracy quickly. The letter bounced between departments, committees formed and reformed. Small grants were issued for preliminary research. Meanwhile, Europe was falling. France collapsed. Britain stood alone under bombardment. And somewhere in occupied territory, German scientists were working on uranium. At least that's what everyone feared. The race Szilard had anticipated was now undeniable, public, and terrifying. What nobody knew yet, not Szilard, not Einstein, not Roosevelt, was that Hitler had already made a catastrophic error. Beyond expelling Jewish scientists, he'd made a decision that would doom Germany's atomic program. He'd classified nuclear research as Jewish physics, unworthy of proper Aryan attention. His ideology had blinded him to the greatest weapon ever conceived. While the Führer dreamed of vengeance weapons like the V-2 rocket, he was dismissing the one weapon that could actually have changed the war's outcome. Chapter 3. The Manhattan Project begins. Everything changed on December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor shattered America's isolationism and transformed Roosevelt's cautious interest in atomic research into urgent priority. Within months, the Manhattan Project officially launched, the most ambitious, expensive, and secretive scientific endeavor in human history. Its mission: build an atomic bomb before Hitler did. And at the heart of it were Jewish refugees Hitler had expelled. The irony was almost poetic. J. Robert Oppenheimer, chosen to lead the scientific team, wasn't Jewish himself, but he was surrounded by them. Edward Teller, James Frank, Niels Bohr, who'd escaped Denmark, Otto Frisch, Lisa Meitner's nephew, Hans Bethe, Eugene Wigner, John von Neumann. The list reads like a roster of Jewish genius driven from Europe. These were the Untermensch, the supposed inferiors that Nazi ideology had dismissed. Now they were designing the weapon that would erase Nazi Germany from existence. Leo Szilard found himself in Chicago as part of the metallurgical laboratory, the code name for the team tasked with creating the first controlled nuclear chain reaction. This was his theoretical baby, the idea that had struck him at that London traffic light 8 years earlier. Now he'd prove it worked. Working under the University of Chicago's abandoned football stadium, Fermi led the construction of Chicago Pile 1, the world's first nuclear reactor. December 2, 1942, was the day theory became reality. As cadmium control rods were slowly withdrawn from the pile of uranium and graphite blocks, neutron counters clicked faster and faster. The chain reaction was self-sustaining. Fermi calmly announced, "The pile has gone critical," as if he'd just boiled water. But everyone in that room understood they'd just crossed a threshold. They'd proven that humanity could now release the power inside atoms. The atomic age had begun, born in secret beneath a Chicago sports stadium, created largely by refugees from the very regime they were fighting. But as success came closer, Szilard's conscience began to torment him. He'd started this. He'd conceptualized the chain reaction, convinced Einstein to write to Roosevelt, pushed for the Manhattan Project's creation. Now he was watching his theoretical physics transform into engineering, into weapons design, into something that could kill hundreds of thousands of people. The Nazi threat had justified the research, but what happened after the Nazis were defeated? By 1944, intelligence reports confirmed what Szilard had suspected. Germany's atomic program was a disaster. They'd made crucial errors, pursued dead ends, lacked the resources and coordination that America had marshaled. Hitler's anti-Semitism and his dismissal of Jewish physics had crippled them. The Germans were never close to building a bomb. The race that had justified everything was a race against a competitor who'd stumbled at the starting line and never gotten up. This revelation haunted Szilard. If Germany couldn't build the bomb, why were they still building it? The answer was obvious: Japan, and perhaps more ominously, a post-war arms race with the Soviet Union. The weapon he'd conceptualized to stop Hitler was morphing into something else: a demonstration of American power, a deterrent against future enemies, a Pandora's box that once opened could never be closed. The refugee physicist who'd fled Nazi persecution was now trapped in a different kind of nightmare, one of his own creation. The desert site of Los Alamos became a city of ghosts. Brilliant minds isolated in the New Mexico wilderness, racing against deadlines that kept shifting, working on components of a weapon most didn't fully understand. Security was absolute. Letters were censored. Conversations monitored. These scientists, many of whom had fled totalitarian states, now found themselves in a voluntary prison, building the ultimate totalitarian weapon. The contradictions were inescapable, the moral weight crushing. Chapter 4. The bomb that ended one war and started another, July 16, 1945, 5:29 a.m. The Jornada del Muerto Desert in New Mexico, Journey of the Dead Man, proved aptly named. The Trinity test shot illuminated the pre-dawn darkness with a light brighter than 1,000 suns. The flash was visible 200 miles away. The mushroom cloud rose 40,000 feet. The shockwave was felt 100 miles distant. The fireball's heat was 4 times that of the sun's surface. In that moment, Robert Oppenheimer recalled a line from Hindu scripture. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Leo Szilard wasn't there. He'd been deliberately excluded from the test site, partly because of security concerns about his outspoken opposition to using the bomb, partly because the project's military leaders had tired of his constant ethical objections. He learned about Trinity's success through official channels, and the news filled him with dread rather than triumph. His theoretical concept had just vaporized sand into radioactive glass. Now it would vaporize people. Germany had already surrendered in May. Hitler had committed suicide in his bunker as Soviet forces closed in. The Nazi regime Szilard had fled 12 years earlier was destroyed, crushed between Allied armies, its leaders dead or awaiting trial. The original justification for the Manhattan Project, beating Hitler to the bomb, was gone. But the project rumbled forward with bureaucratic momentum, redirected toward Japan, justified now by the potential American casualties of invading the home islands. Szilard made a last-ditch effort to stop it. He drafted a petition signed by 70 Manhattan Project scientists urging President Truman not to use the bomb without warning, without demonstration, without giving Japan a chance to surrender. The petition never reached Truman's desk. It was blocked by General Leslie Groves, the military director of the Manhattan Project, who saw these scientists as tools who'd served their purpose and should now be silent. Szilard's expertise in physics didn't grant him authority in military strategy. August 6, 1945. The Enola Gay, a B-29 bomber, released Little Boy over Hiroshima. The uranium bomb, the type that used the chain reaction Szilard had conceptualized, detonated at 1,900 feet with the force of 15,000 tons of TNT. The fireball reached 18 million degrees Fahrenheit. Everything within a mile of ground zero was incinerated instantly. The shock wave flattened buildings for miles. Thermal radiation burned people into shadows on walls. An estimated 70,000 people died immediately. Thousands more would die from radiation poisoning in the following weeks and months. 3 days later, Fat Man, a plutonium bomb, destroyed Nagasaki. Another 40,000 dead instantly, thousands more later. Japan surrendered on August 15th. World War II ended. The weapon that Jewish refugees had built to stop Hitler had instead stopped Imperial Japan. But the price was counted in vaporized cities, melted flesh, children with keloid scars, and radiation that would poison generations. The Manhattan Project scientists had succeeded beyond all measure, and many of them would never forgive themselves. Szilard's reaction was complex. He felt vindicated in his warnings about atomic weapons. He'd been right about their devastating power. He felt horror at the civilian casualties. This wasn't what he'd envisioned when conceiving the chain reaction in London. He felt betrayed by the military's use of the bomb without the demonstration he'd advocated for. And underneath everything, he felt a crushing responsibility. His idea, his letters to Roosevelt, his persistence in pushing the project forward. The atomic age was here, and he was one of its fathers. But perhaps the deepest irony went unspoken. Hitler's racial ideology had doomed him. By driving out Jewish scientists, by dismissing Jewish physics, by prioritizing ideology over expertise, he'd handed his enemies a decisive weapon. The very people he'd tried to exterminate had engineered the final destruction of his Reich. Not directly, Germany fell to conventional forces, but symbolically, the connection was undeniable. The Hungarian Jew, standing at a London traffic light in 1933, had conceived the weapon that 12 years later would demonstrate to the world that Nazi Germany's ideology was not just morally bankrupt, but strategically suicidal. Chapter 5. The Conscience of the Atomic Age. The war ended, But Leo Szilard's fight had just begun. While many Manhattan Project scientists returned to universities, grateful to resume normal research, Szilard couldn't let go. The bomb haunted him. He'd opened Pandora's box, and now he dedicated his life to trying to control what had emerged. But he quickly discovered that creating atomic weapons was far easier than controlling them. His first battle was against the May-Johnson Bill, legislation that would have placed all nuclear research, including peacetime applications, under permanent military control. Szilard saw this as catastrophic: the militarization of science, the end of open research, the creation of a permanent warfare state. He lobbied Congress tirelessly, organized other scientists, and testified with the same intensity he'd once used to create the Manhattan Project. The bill was defeated, replaced by civilian control through the Atomic Energy Commission. It was a small victory, but it established a principle. Atomic power belonged to society, not just to generals. But his biggest concern was the arms race he'd predicted. The Soviet Union, America's wartime ally, was now its post-war rival. Stalin had spies inside the Manhattan Project from the beginning. Soviet physicists, many of them brilliant, some of them also motivated by ideology that opposed fascism, were already working on their own bomb. Szilard understood the mathematics. If both superpowers had atomic weapons, the logic of deterrence would demand more weapons, bigger weapons, faster weapons, until the world sat on a nuclear powder keg waiting for a spark. He proposed what seemed radical at the time: international control of atomic energy. Share the knowledge, create a global authority, make atomic weapons impossible for any single nation to build or use. He argued passionately that the only security in the atomic age was collective security, that national stockpiles of nuclear weapons guaranteed mutual destruction, not mutual safety. The idea went nowhere. America wasn't about to surrender its nuclear monopoly, and Stalin's Soviet Union was even less interested in transparency. August 29, 1949, shattered any remaining illusions. The Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, First Lightning, ending America's 4-year nuclear monopoly far sooner than anyone expected. The arms race was official. Both sides began developing hydrogen bombs, fusion weapons thousands of times more powerful than the fission bombs dropped on Japan. Edward Teller, Szilard's fellow Hungarian refugee, became the driving force behind the American H-bomb. Once again, a Jewish scientist fleeing fascism was creating weapons of unprecedented destruction. Szilard and Teller, once friends who'd driven together to visit Einstein, now represented opposite poles of atomic age morality. Teller argued that Soviet aggression justified any weapon that maintained American superiority. Szilard countered that building bigger bombs only ensured that when war came, it would be apocalyptic. Their debates became legendary, two Hungarian accents arguing the fate of civilization in university lecture halls and government offices. Both were brilliant, both were Jewish refugees, both had helped create the atomic age, but they had violently different visions of how to survive it. The 1950s became a blur of activism for Szilard. He wrote articles warning about radioactive fallout from nuclear tests. He organized conferences bringing together American and Soviet scientists, trying to build bridges between enemies. He proposed arms control agreements that were dismissed as naive by both governments. He watched in frustration as the bomb stockpiles grew, dozens becoming hundreds, becoming thousands, while politicians spoke casually about acceptable losses in nuclear war measured in tens of millions of dead. In 1962, the world came to the brink. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought American and Soviet nuclear weapons into direct confrontation. For 13 days, the planet held its breath as Kennedy and Khrushchev played atomic chicken. Szilard, by then weakening from the bladder cancer that would kill him, worked frantically behind the scenes, reaching out to contacts in both governments, using back channels built over years of advocacy. The crisis resolved, but barely. Both sides had looked into the abyss and stepped back, but the abyss remained. Szilard's final years were marked by a profound shift. He'd spent 2 decades trying to control the bomb. Now he turned to biology, driven by the same impulse that had animated his physics, the conviction that science could solve fundamental problems. He made significant contributions to molecular biology and even proposed theories about memory and aging. It was as if, having helped birth the technology of death, he wanted to contribute to the science of life. The refugee who'd fled Hitler conceptualized the chain reaction and then spent decades warning about his creation, was looking for redemption in DNA rather than atoms. Chapter 6. The Legacy of the Man Who Saw Too Clearly. Leo Szilard died on May 30, 1964 in La Jolla, California. He was 66 years old. His death received modest attention. A few obituaries in scientific journals, remembrances from colleagues, but nothing like the fanfare that greeted Einstein's passing 9 years earlier. Szilard had always been a background figure, the man behind the scenes, the idea generator who pushed others into the spotlight. Even in death, he remained somewhat obscure, known primarily to physicists and historians rather than the general public. But his legacy is impossible to escape. Every nuclear power plant generating electricity uses the chain reaction he conceptualized. Every nuclear weapon in every arsenal, American, Russian, Chinese, British, French, Israeli, Pakistani, Indian, North Korean, operates on principles he first articulated. The approximately 13 WWII nuclear warheads that currently exist, enough to destroy human civilization several times over, are all descendants of that moment at a London traffic light in 1933. For better and worse, Szilard shaped the world we inhabit. The historical irony he embodied remains profound. Hitler's ideology destroyed him strategically. By elevating racial purity over scientific excellence, the Nazis expelled approximately 2,000 Jewish scientists and intellectuals. These weren't random refugees. They were among Europe's greatest minds. 16 would go on to win Nobel Prizes. Dozens made fundamental contributions to the Allied war effort, not just in atomic physics but in radar, operations research, computing, cryptography, and countless other fields. Imagine an alternate history where Germany retained its Jewish scientists. Werner Heisenberg working with Leo Szilard, Otto Hahn collaborating with Lisa Meitner without her having to flee. German physics, already the world's best in the 1920s, augmented rather than gutted. A Nazi atomic program with proper resources, brilliant minds, and Hitler's full backing. It's entirely possible Germany would have developed atomic weapons first, and the war's outcome would have been radically different. Hitler's racism didn't just cost him individual scientists, it arguably cost him the war. But Szilard's story also asks uncomfortable questions about genius and responsibility. He conceptualized the chain reaction with pure intentions, scientific curiosity, theoretical problem-solving. He pushed for the Manhattan Project to stop Hitler, a justified defensive response to fascist aggression. But intentions don't control outcomes. The bomb he enabled killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians, initiated an arms race that threatened human extinction, and created the permanent anxiety of the nuclear age. Is a scientist responsible for how their discoveries are used? Can you put knowledge back in the bottle once it's released? These questions tormented Szilard for 3 decades, and they remain unanswered. Modern physicists work on artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, nanotechnology, quantum computing, fields with transformative and potentially catastrophic implications. They face the same dilemmas Szilard did: whether to pursue knowledge regardless of consequences, whether to speak out against misuse of their work, whether to stop research that might be dangerous. There's no clear answer, but Szilard's life offers a template. You can't escape responsibility, but you can dedicate yourself to mitigation. Today, the threat Szilard spent his final years warning about remains. Nuclear arsenals are maintained, tensions between nuclear powers flare periodically, and the possibility of accidental or intentional nuclear war persists. 9 countries have nuclear weapons. Several more have the technical capability to build them quickly. The knowledge Szilard helped unleash can't be forgotten. The weapons can't be uninvented. The threat can't be eliminated completely. We live permanently in the world that traffic light revelation created. Yet there's also a strange tribute in our current reality. Nuclear weapons have never been used in war since Nagasaki. Despite the Cold War's crises, despite regional conflicts, despite terrorism and rogue states, the atomic genie has remained relatively contained for 80 years. Perhaps the very destructiveness Szilard feared has served as the deterrent he eventually advocated for. Mutually assured destruction, horrible as the concept is, has prevented World War III. The weapon designed to end Hitler's war has, through its sheer terror, prevented others. Szilard's final years working on biology represent one more irony. The man who helped birth the technology of death ended his career studying the mechanisms of life. He never found the redemption he sought. You can't balance vaporized cities with discoveries about DNA. But he tried. That attempt at balance, that refusal to accept his role as merely the bomb's architect, defines his legacy as much as the chain reaction itself. He saw too clearly, acted decisively, spent decades regretting and trying to correct course. In short, he was intensely, devastatingly human. The inventor Hitler tried to silence didn't just help design the weapon that sealed Nazi Germany's fate. He designed the weapon that defined the modern age, for better and worse, and then spent the rest of his life trying to prevent the apocalypse he'd made possible. Standing at that London traffic light, Leo Szilard saw the future more clearly than anyone in history. What he saw both saved and endangered the world. That paradox is his monument, and we're all still living in its shadow.